The air in the courtroom was heavy, as if everyone could sense that something was about to snap. Victor Harlan leaned against the lectern with that trademark smirk, the kind that said he believed he had already won. His tone dripped with false politeness as he leaned in closer to the witness stand. "So, Ms. Cruz," he said, each word sharp enough to cut, "are we really supposed to believe that someone like you, someone with no law degree, no titles, no power, knows more than the experts I've brought in here today?" The gallery erupted in soft murmurs, whispers racing through the benches like electricity. Harlan basked in it, his grin widening. He had turned the witness box into his stage, and for a moment it seemed Elena Cruz was just another victim of his performance. But Elena didn't flinch. She folded her hands neatly in her lap, her eyes steady, her voice quiet, but unwavering. "Mr. Harlan," she began, pausing just long enough for the room to lean forward, "you've mistaken power for truth. The truth doesn't need a title. It just needs to be heard." The words landed like a thunderclap. For the first time, the prosecutor's smile faltered. His eyes darted around the room, searching for a laugh, an ally, anything to break the silence. But there was nothing. Not even the scratch of a pen. Elena's calmness made the silence heavier, and in that stillness the gallery understood what had just happened. The balance of power had shifted, not with a shout, not with a spectacle, but with a sentence so simple it stripped away every ounce of Harlan's theatrics. The judge cleared his throat, the gavel tapping once as if to remind the room to breathe again. But no one could forget the moment they had just witnessed. Harlan, the master of intimidation, had been caught off guard by the very witness he thought he could break. And Elena? She sat tall, unshaken, a quiet storm wrapped in dignity. But to understand why this single sentence shook the nation, we need to rewind. This was not just another trial. On paper, it looked like a routine corruption case, an investigation into a tangle of money trails, backroom deals, and shadowy contracts that reached into the heart of local politics. But beneath the surface, everyone knew it was bigger than that. This was about whether the justice system still belonged to the people, or whether it had become just another tool in the hands of the powerful. Victor Harlan had made sure of it. The prosecutor didn't present himself as a servant of the law. He sold himself as the law incarnate. Every press conference was staged like a campaign rally, every statement crafted for headlines. "Justice will not be mocked," he declared to cameras weeks before the trial began. Reporters repeated his words as if they were gospel. Overnight, Harlan transformed himself from a name in the courthouse into the face of righteous authority. And for a time, it worked. Polls showed overwhelming faith in him. Editorials praised his hard line, calling him fearless, unshakable, the man willing to clean house in a city long plagued by corruption. To the public, Harlan was no longer just a prosecutor. He was a crusader. Elena Cruz could not have been further from that image. She wasn't polished, wasn't rehearsed, wasn't someone who ever asked for the spotlight. She was, by all accounts, an ordinary citizen, a working woman, a daughter who helped her aging parents pay their rent, a neighbor who never forgot to bring tamales to the block party. She didn't stand at podiums or rehearse statements for cameras. She lived her life in the shadows of people like Harlan, people who made decisions that rippled down to families like hers. That was what made the contrast so stark and so unfair. Here was a prosecutor draped in accolades, wielding the full force of the state, with media and money behind him. And there was Elena, one woman called to testify, with nothing but her memory, her honesty, and her courage. The imbalance of power was obvious to everyone watching. Harlan had the advantage, not just legally but theatrically. He strutted around the courtroom as though it were his personal stage, using volume and cadence like a showman. Elena, by contrast, spoke softly, choosing her words with care, and that made her an easy target. To the cynical, she looked vulnerable. To Harlan, she looked like prey. Yet that imbalance was also what gave the trial its gravity. This wasn't just about facts on a ledger or signatures. On a contract, it was about whether truth itself had a fighting chance when stacked against the weight of power and arrogance. If Harlan succeeded in steamrolling her, the lesson would be clear. The system rewards performance, not honesty. But if Elena could hold her ground even for a moment, she could expose the cracks in his empire of control. That's why the nation watched so closely. The story wasn't only about contracts and corruption. It was about identity, dignity, and the courage of an ordinary person daring to face down an untouchable figure. And in that clash, people saw themselves. They saw their own struggles, their own silencing, their own frustration at leaders who spoke with certainty while ignoring those who lived the consequences of their decisions. Which is why, when Elena finally spoke her truth, the room fell into that unforgettable silence. It wasn't just a witness answering a question, it was the people answering back to power. But the arrogance didn't begin here. It was years in the making. Victor Harlan didn't stumble into power. He sculpted it, polished it, and wore it like armor. Born into privilege, the son of a well-connected attorney and a corporate lobbyist, his trajectory was set long before he argued his first case. He attended the kind of prep schools where connections mattered more than test scores, the kind of institutions that didn't just teach law, but taught entitlement. At Harvard, then Yale, he carved out his reputation as the sharp-tongued debater who never admitted defeat. Professors admired his wit. Peers feared his temper. From the beginning, Harlan wasn't content with simply practicing law. He wanted to dominate it. Early on, he learned the art of theatrics, pausing just long enough to let jurors hang on his words, twisting arguments into sound bites that reporters couldn't resist quoting. His cases became less about justice and more about performance, about feeding the narrative of Victor Harlan, the unstoppable force. It worked. Media outlets loved him. He gave interviews with the confidence of a man auditioning for higher office, sprinkling his answers with sweeping moral claims. "Corruption doesn't scare me," he once declared on a cable news panel, his jaw tight, his gaze unflinching. "I'll drag it into the light no matter how powerful the players are." Clips like that traveled fast, reshared by pundits who saw him as a rising star. Soon, his name wasn't just in the local papers. It was on national broadcasts painted in glowing terms. Inside the courtroom, his style was unmistakable. He walked into trials like a general leading troops, barking objections, slicing into witnesses with a grin that signaled he already knew the ending. Colleagues whispered that he had the uncanny ability to make juries laugh at his jokes, even when they weren't funny. Others said he had mastered the art of humiliation, turning a shaky witness into a punchline, using volume and sarcasm until their credibility crumbled. But behind the veneer of triumphs, the cracks had always been there. Ethics complaints shadowed his victories. Allegations of bullying opposing counsel, of bending discovery rules, of leaking strategic details to the press to poison the jury pool. None of it stuck. Not because the claims lacked merit, but because Harlan knew how to weaponize his reputation. He was untouchable, or at least he appeared to be. The institutions that should have checked him were dazzled instead by his win record. And then there was his ambition. For Harlan, the law was never the end game. It was a platform. Each case was less about the defendant or the charges and more about building the Victor Harlan brand. Observers noted how he always positioned himself in front of the cameras after verdicts, giving stirring soundbites about justice served, while rarely acknowledging the communities that bore the weight of his decisions. His colleagues whispered that he was already courting donors, already sketching out a political career. Ruthlessness defined him. Associates described how he treated allies like stepping stones and rivals like prey. One former co-worker recalled how Harlan once sabotaged a younger prosecutor's case just to make himself look stronger in comparison. "He doesn't just want to win," the co-worker said bitterly. "He wants to make sure you lose." And yet, despite it all, the public admired him. Or perhaps they admired the illusion. In an era of cynicism about institutions, he offered the image of strength, of certainty. People wanted to believe someone like Harlan could sweep away corruption with sheer force of will. They mistook his confidence for integrity, his intimidation for leadership. But the facade was beginning to crack. Journalists had started revisiting those ethics complaints. Defense attorneys whispered about patterns of misconduct. Even allies began to question whether his hunger for cameras was overshadowing his duty to the law. There were murmurs, subtle, careful, but unmistakable, that perhaps Victor Harlan wasn't the champion of justice he claimed to be. Still, he strutted into every courtroom as if invincible, secure in the belief that no one could challenge him. And when Elena Cruz was called to testify, Harlan didn't see her as a threat. To him, she was just another name on the witness list, another ordinary person he could crush with a single sneer. But Harlan's arrogance blinded him. He failed to see that sometimes truth does not arrive in the form of powerful speeches or elaborate cases. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through the voice of someone with nothing to lose but their dignity. Yet while Harlan crafted his empire of ego, Elena Cruz was living a very different story. Elena Cruz's story was never supposed to cross paths with headlines, cameras, or the ambitions of men like Victor Harlan. She was the kind of person who kept her head down, who believed in working hard, paying her dues, and taking care of her family. Her life was not about spectacle, it was about survival, responsibility, and dignity, and yet, it was precisely that quiet resilience that made her the kind of witness Harlan never knew how to handle. Elena was the daughter of immigrants who came to the United States with little more than a dream and the clothes on their backs. Her father worked long shifts at a factory where the machines drowned out conversation, his hands scarred from years of labor. Her mother cleaned offices at night, her body weary but her spirit unbroken. From them, Elena inherited a simple creed. Dignity is not about titles. It's about how you carry yourself when no one is watching. As the eldest child, Elena became more than a daughter. She was a second parent, a translator, a guide through the maze of systems her family didn't yet understand. When her father was injured on the job and workers' comp forms arrived in dense legal jargon, Elena was the one who sat at the kitchen table late into the night deciphering them word by word. When her younger siblings needed someone to show up at parent-teacher conferences because her parents couldn't leave their shifts, it was Elena who walked into the room, steady and confident despite her young age. She worked 2 jobs through college, not glamorous ones, but the kind that kept the lights on and the rent paid. Morning shifts at a diner, evening hours at a corner store, weekends tutoring neighborhood kids in math. Every dollar mattered, every sacrifice had a purpose. She didn't complain, she simply endured. People in her community came to know her as the dependable one, the neighbor who could be trusted to keep a secret, the friend who would tell you the truth even when it was hard to hear. Honesty was her currency, and everyone who knew her respected it. Elena never sought attention, but she couldn't escape admiration. Her professors remembered her as the student who always raised her hand to defend the vulnerable in classroom debates. Her co-workers described her as the person who never cut corners, even when no one would have noticed. And her siblings saw her as the anchor who held the family together, the one who made sure they never forgot both where they came from and where they could go. Elena's path to the courtroom was not direct. She wasn't an activist, wasn't a politician, and never imagined herself standing before a judge. What brought her there was something far simpler. She witnessed something, and she told the truth about it. That truth happened to collide with the interests of powerful people, and suddenly, her name was on a subpoena. She could have stepped back. She could have claimed she didn't remember. She could have joined the long line of ordinary citizens who decided it was safer to stay silent. But Elena's conscience wouldn't allow it. To her, truth wasn't negotiable. It wasn't a weapon to be twisted for convenience. It was a responsibility. And so, despite every warning from friends who feared what Harlan might do to her on the stand, Elena agreed to testify. By the time the trial began, the contrast between her and Harlan couldn't have been sharper. He arrived with cameras chasing him, flanked by reporters and staffers who treated his every word like breaking news. Elena arrived alone, carrying a modest purse, dressed simply, her hair pulled back, her expression calm, but unshaken. She didn't come to perform. She came to speak. To those who sat in the gallery, she seemed almost too ordinary, too unassuming. Some wondered whether she was strong enough to withstand Harlan's fire. Others whispered that she looked nervous, that she might crumble under his theatrics. But those who truly knew her, her family, her neighbors, the people who had watched her shoulder burdens far heavier than cross-examination, understood that she possessed a different kind of strength. It wasn't loud, it wasn't showy. It was the kind of strength that doesn't need to announce itself, the kind that reveals itself only when tested. And when that moment came, Elena didn't falter. The daughter of immigrants who had scrubbed floors and worked machines until their bodies ached didn't tremble in the face of Victor Harlan's arrogance. She carried with her every sacrifice her parents had made, every lesson she had learned about resilience, every quiet moment where she chose honesty over convenience. That was her foundation, and it was unshakable. Her journey had never been about power. It had been about responsibility. And in that courtroom, responsibility meant looking directly at a man who believed himself untouchable and refusing to be silenced. And so when she took the stand, no one, not even Harlan, expected what would come next. The duel began the moment Victor Harlan straightened his tie and approached the witness stand like a predator circling its prey. His shoes echoed on the marble floor, each step deliberate, each pause calculated to remind the room that he owned the stage. "Ms. Cruz," he began, voice dripping with false courtesy, "you've claimed to remember details from events that occurred months ago. Tell us, how could someone of your background possibly recall specifics better than trained investigators?" The question wasn't about memory. It was about class, about power, about planting doubt in the minds of jurors by painting Elena as unqualified. He let the words hang, scanning the faces in the jury box as though daring them to smirk. Elena didn't bite. She sat upright, her hands folded neatly, her expression calm. "Because I was there," she answered simply. "I lived it. That makes it unforgettable." The gallery shifted uncomfortably. Harlan's smile tightened. He leaned closer, raising his voice just enough to dominate the room. "But you're no expert, are you? No degrees, no forensic training. Just your word. And you expect us to believe that your word outweighs the evidence of professionals?" His tone turned mocking, emphasizing the word just, as though her existence itself was a lesser fact. Elena inhaled slowly, meeting his gaze. "I expect you to believe what is true." That answer, plain as it was, unsettled him. He pivoted sharply, rifling through his notes with a theatrical flourish. "Let's talk about your work history, Ms. Cruz. Long hours at a diner, shifts at a corner store, odd jobs strung together. Surely exhaustion, financial stress, and distraction might cloud one's memory. Isn't that fair to say?" The insinuation hung heavy. She was too tired, too burdened, too ordinary to be trusted. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Elena's voice remained steady. "Exhaustion doesn't erase the truth. It sharpens it. When you live through struggle every day, you don't forget the details. You carry them with you." For the first time, a few jurors nodded. Harlan noticed. His jaw flexed. He turned to the judge with a half smirk, half complaint, as if to suggest the witness was playing philosopher instead of answering questions. But the judge said nothing, so Harlan doubled down. He paced in front of the jury box, gesturing broadly, his voice rising like a sermon. "Ladies and gentlemen, this witness would have you believe she remembers conversations word for word, events minute by minute, yet she cannot produce a single note, a single recording, a single shred of proof." He spun toward Elena, eyes narrowing. "Isn't it true that without evidence your testimony is nothing but opinion?" The silence was suffocating. All eyes locked on Elena. Harlan leaned in, convinced he had finally cornered her. His grin widened, certain she would stammer, certain she would crumble under the weight of his accusation. But Elena didn't stammer. She didn't crumble. She let the silence linger just long enough for the tension to build like a held breath. Her gaze never wavered. Her posture never slumped. And then, with one sentence, Elena Cruz shattered his performance. The room was still, heavy with anticipation. Victor Harlan stood poised, savoring what he thought was his triumph. His voice had risen, his hands gestured grandly. His final question had been designed to finish her. And yet, in that silence, it wasn't Harlan who controlled the room. It was Elena Cruz. She sat calmly, shoulders square, eyes steady. When she finally spoke, her words cut through the air like glass breaking. "You asked for proof, Mr. Harlan, but the proof isn't missing. It's been sitting in your own files this whole time." A ripple of shock swept through the gallery. Harlan blinked, his confidence flickering. "Excuse me?" he demanded, trying to recover. Elena's tone didn't change. It was calm, deliberate, the voice of someone who had nothing to fear. The meeting on April 14th. You said I couldn't remember the details, but I don't need notes. I was there. And the reason I remember it so clearly is because you were there too. The words landed like a thunderclap. Gasps erupted from the benches. Even the court stenographer momentarily froze, her fingers hovering above the keys. Harlan's face flushed a deep crimson. That's absurd, he snapped, his voice cracking slightly under the weight of disbelief. You're suggesting I was present? That's the truth, Elena interrupted, her voice firm but not raised. You asked how I could recall conversations without evidence. The evidence is your own presence. You can question my memory, Mr. Harlan, but you cannot erase where you were. The gallery erupted again, murmurs tumbling over each other. The judge's gavel slammed against the bench. Order in the court. He barked, but even his authority couldn't erase the collective gasp that lingered in the air. Harlan stumbled, his carefully constructed persona beginning to crack. His smirk was gone, replaced by the frantic blinking of a man cornered in his own trap. He shuffled his notes as though they might rescue him, but the pages only fluttered uselessly in his trembling hands. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he said, his voice strained, this is a distraction, a desperate attempt to discredit me. Elena didn't move. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than his defense. The jurors weren't looking at him anymore. Their eyes were fixed on her, on the calm certainty of her testimony. Harlan tried again, his volume climbing. She's twisting facts. This is manipulation. But the more he spoke, the more hollow he sounded. The confidence that once commanded the room now reeked of desperation. His words came too fast, too defensive, too rehearsed. Elena finally spoke again, her voice steady, almost gentle. You can call me ordinary. You can question my education, my work, my memory. But you cannot question what we both lived. You were in that room. You heard the same words I did. And the reason I remember them is because they mattered, because they revealed the truth you've tried to bury. The gallery leaned forward as if pulled by invisible strings. A reporter scribbled frantically. A juror covered his mouth in disbelief. The judge's gavel slammed again. I said order. But his voice, too, betrayed a hint of shock. Harlan's hands gripped the lectern now, white-knuckled. His composure, his armor, was gone. For years he had bullied witnesses into silence, had turned testimony into theater. But this time the stage had collapsed beneath him. You don't get to define truth, Mr. Harlan, Elena continued. You don't get to decide whose voice matters and whose doesn't. I may not have your titles, I may not have your cameras, but I have my integrity. And that's something you can't take from me. A gasp, then a murmur of approval rippled through the gallery. It wasn't loud, yet, but it was unmistakable. Harlan's face twisted. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. The words wouldn't come. His trademark smirk, his polished swagger, his air of invincibility, they were gone. What stood before the court was not the fearless crusader he'd branded himself as, but a man rattled, exposed, and desperate. The silence that followed was crushing. Even the hum of the fluorescent light seemed louder, and at the center of it all, Elena Cruz sat unmoving, unshaken, her calm presence radiating more authority than Harlan had ever managed with his theatrics. The judge sighed heavily, tapping the gavel once more, softer this time. Proceed, Mr. Harlan, he instructed, though even he seemed to recognize the futility of the command, but there was no proceeding, not really. Whatever questions Harlan asked after that would sound feeble. Whatever objections he raised would sound petty. The trial had just shifted. The illusion of his control was gone, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. For a man who had built his empire on performance, on appearances, on intimidation, the unraveling was devastating. Each second of his silence, each flicker of panic across his face, only confirmed what Elena's words had exposed. The king had no clothes. Elena leaned back slightly in the witness chair, her expression serene. She didn't need to gloat, didn't need to raise her voice. The truth had spoken for itself. And in that moment, the audience, the jurors, the gallery, even the reporters scribbling notes, saw the story for what it really was. Not a contest between equals, not a routine cross-examination, but a reckoning. The powerful prosecutor who had mocked her as just an ordinary citizen had been undone by that very ordinariness. Her strength was her honesty. Her weapon was her truth. When she finished, Elena didn't even look at Harlan. She turned her gaze forward, her posture dignified, her hands folded once more. The performance was over, but she hadn't been the one performing. If the courtroom was stunned, the world outside would soon erupt. The verdict wasn't in yet, but outside the courtroom, the trial had already reached the court of public opinion, and Elena Cruz had won. Within hours of her testimony, clips of the moment began circulating online. A grainy cell phone recording, smuggled out despite strict courtroom rules, captured the instant when she said, "You were there too." The audio was shaky, the camera tilted, but the impact was undeniable. Hashtags bloomed across platforms like wildfire. Cruz moment. Truth over power. She said it. On Twitter, users wrote threads breaking down the scene frame by frame. One post with 1 million views read, "This is what happens when integrity meets arrogance." Elena Cruz didn't just testify, she exposed the game. On TikTok, teenagers remixed her words into music tracks, layering her calm declaration over pounding beats. Some clips became rallying cries, others memes. A video set to slow motion, with the caption, "You were there too," hit 10 million plays in a day. Late-night comedians pounced. One joked, "Victor Harlan walked into that courtroom with the swagger of a prize fighter," and Elena Cruz reminded him, he forgot his gloves. The studio audience roared with laughter, replaying the moment again on the big screen, this time with cartoon sound effects timed to Harlan's stammers. But it wasn't just comedy. Serious commentators, too, weighed in. A retired judge wrote in an op-ed, "What Elena Cruz demonstrated is that truth, plainly spoken, can be more powerful than any performance. In a system where theatrics often overshadow substance, her courage was nothing short of revolutionary." Meanwhile, memes flooded Instagram, split-screen images of David and Goliath, with Elena's face photoshopped onto David, sling in hand. Another viral image showed Harlan as a crumbling statue, Elena's single sentence captioned as the hammer that cracked it. The ripple effect didn't stop online. On talk radio, callers invoked her name as a symbol of dignity. At college campuses, student groups organized impromptu rallies, chanting her words. For immigrants and working-class families, Elena wasn't just a witness. She was a mirror. She was proof that someone who looked like them, who lived their struggles, could stand tall in the face of power and not bend. Harlan, once untouchable, suddenly found himself mocked, scrutinized, diminished. Editorial cartoons painted him as a balloon deflating, his grand posture collapsing into a puddle of ego. Former allies distanced themselves, careful not to be dragged down with him. Even in his own circles, whispers began. Maybe he wasn't invincible after all. For years he had thrived on the myth of inevitability, that he was the prosecutor who couldn't lose, the bulldog who shredded opposition. But myths are fragile things. And in the span of a single afternoon, Elena Cruz had punctured his. The cultural shift was immediate, electric. What had started as a courtroom drama now belonged to the people. Strangers left comments like, "I've never felt so seen by a witness in my life," and "She gave us all permission to speak our truth." The clip was replayed on the evening news, not once but on every channel, introduced with solemn voices that framed it as a turning point in the trial, and perhaps something larger. Anchors described it as the moment arrogance met its match, a turning tide, a testimony that echoed beyond the walls of the court. In living rooms across the country, families watched together. Some shook their heads in disbelief that a lone witness could rattle a figure as powerful as Harlan. Others smiled, proud that someone so ordinary could turn the tables. And for millions, it wasn't just entertainment, it was vindication. Because Elena's victory wasn't only about a legal battle, it was about the deeper question of who gets to define truth. For generations, people like her had been dismissed, belittled, treated as less than. But with one sentence, she reminded the nation that truth doesn't belong to the powerful. It belongs to those who live it. And so the shockwaves spread. Through hashtags, headlines, punchlines, and op-eds. Through memes and music videos. Through whispers in offices and shouts on campuses. Elena Cruz had become more than a witness. She had become a symbol. But Elena wasn't done. Her closing words left a message that still echoes today. The courtroom had grown quieter now, the chaos of Harlan's collapse fading into something more profound. Reporters still scribbled furiously. Jurors still exchanged glances heavy with meaning, but all eyes returned to Elena Cruz. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't moved with theatrics, yet somehow she commanded the room more completely than Victor Harlan ever had. At the judge's request, she was given the chance to conclude her testimony, and instead of using the moment to boast or strike at Harlan again, Elena chose a different path. She leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped, and spoke with the calm certainty that had carried her through every word. "Power can intimidate," she said softly, "but truth outlives power." The sentence lingered in the air, simple and unpolished, yet it carried more weight than any legal jargon could. It wasn't just an observation about her testimony. It was a reflection of the larger struggle being waged in that courtroom and beyond it. She continued, "I know what it feels like to be told you don't belong, to be underestimated because of your job, your background, or your accent. I've lived that my whole life. But I also know that dignity is not given by titles or wealth. Dignity is something no one can take from you, because it comes from telling the truth, even when your voice shakes." The jury sat still, riveted. Some leaned forward as though they didn't want to miss a single word. The gallery listened in silence, the earlier murmurs replaced by something like reverence. Even the judge's usual stern mask seemed to soften, just slightly. Elena did not look at Harlan. She wasn't speaking to him anymore. She was speaking to everyone, to the jurors, to the spectators, to the millions who would later see her words replayed across screens. She was speaking to the single parent watching from a cramped apartment, to the student working late shifts to cover tuition, to the immigrant family told to stay quiet, to endure. "What I want people to understand," she said, "is that truth doesn't need permission. It doesn't need credentials. It doesn't bend to power. Power fades. Power crumbles. But truth endures." Her words carried the rhythm of something larger than testimony. They carried the rhythm of a creed, a reminder, a call. And in that moment, the courtroom stopped being just a room. It became a mirror, reflecting the struggles and hopes of a nation. For years, Victor Harlan had been the story. The prosecutor who devoured his opponents. The man who made witnesses wilt under pressure. But that narrative had ended. Now it was Elena Cruz's voice that filled the silence. Elena Cruz's story that resonated. She drew in one final breath, her gaze steady. "I didn't come here to be extraordinary. I came here because telling the truth is what every ordinary person deserves to do without fear. That's all. And it's why moments like this remind us of who we are at our best." The gallery exhaled, as though they had been holding their breath for minutes. Some closed their eyes, as if savoring the moment. Others wiped away quiet tears. In the weeks to come, pundits would replay her words endlessly. Teachers would quote them in classrooms, pastors in sermons, parents in conversations at the dinner table. They would live on in hashtags, in posters at rallies, in handwritten notes slipped onto community boards. Because what Elena had offered was not just a rebuttal to Victor Harlan. She had offered a reminder to everyone who had ever felt small, ignored, dismissed, that truth, when spoken with courage, is unstoppable. And it's why moments like this remind us of who we are at our best. In the end, the story of Prosecutor Fumbles, Witness Drops the Truth, was never really about a courtroom clash. It was about something bigger. It was about what happens when arrogance collides with honesty, when performance meets integrity, when intimidation tries and fails to silence the truth. Victor Harlan walked into that courtroom convinced he could bully his way to another victory. He left with his reputation shattered, undone by the very ordinariness he mocked. His stumble wasn't just a fumble. It was the unraveling of a myth. And Elena Cruz? She didn't just drop a truth. She delivered a reminder that truth doesn't belong to the powerful. It belongs to those who carry it, who live it, who dare to speak it even when the odds are stacked against them. She became a symbol not because she sought the spotlight, but because she showed that dignity can outshine intimidation. That's why this moment matters. Because it's not just about her. It's about us. Every immigrant who's been told they don't belong. Every worker who's been dismissed as unimportant. Every voice that's been silenced by power. Elena's stand proves that our stories, our truths, are stronger than any performance. So here's the call. If you believe in truth over power, if you believe in dignity over arrogance, share this story. Let it ripple outward. Subscribe, stay with us, and be part of a community that refuses to let intimidation win. Because in times like these, it's not enough to watch history unfold. We have to carry it forward. And together we can.